I got 6 here, 6 here. Can I lead with that? All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Glenn Moots, and I teach political science and philosophy here at Northwood, and I am pleased to introduce tonight's Freedom Seminar guest, Dr. Wilfred McClay. Before I do that, I want to remind you that our continuing Freedom Seminar, of which this is part, will be a film next week. We'll be over in Plaster, on the other side of campus. And that'll be at 7 o'clock. So that's in Plaster 120. And the film is on how New Zealand rescued themselves from financial collapse with free market reforms. And we have a discussion leader who's coming all the way from Hawaii. So please be here for that. I also want to let you know that there's a video contest, and the deadline is in April. So you have a long way to go. And again, Dale, the theme is
Our American Republic, can we keep it?
There you go. Our American Republic, can we keep it? And you produce a 3 to 5 minute video. It is submitted for judging, and if you win, you get $2,000. Now, is that a scholarship or is that cash?
That is a cash award, and 10 runners up get 500 each.
Next year is going to be a bear market for crypto, so you should do crypto. Okay. All right. For those of you who need to record your attendance for class, the Impact Program, or the Northwood Idea Badging Program, there are some QR codes out in the lobby that you can use, and also submit the form prior to leaving. Also, please note that tonight we have a reception. So when we're done with tonight's event, you can go back there and eat lots of sugar and coffee. So stick around for that. Okay, our speaker tonight is a Professor Wilfred McClay, who holds the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization at Hillsdale College. And if I'm to list all of Bill's bona fides, I should have started when he got in the car to drive up. So this is just the short list. He's a Johnny. He's a graduate of St. John's College in Annapolis and earned his PhD from one of our finest graduate programs in history at Johns Hopkins. And prior to being at Hillsdale, you went to Hillsdale in 2021, right? Before that, he was at the University of Oklahoma, University of Tennessee, Pepperdine, Tulane, Georgetown, and University of Dallas. And that may sound like he can't keep a job, but some of those were endowed professorships and some of them were visiting. And University of Rome too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have questions about Italy, you know who to ask. You're not allowed back. Okay. Among the books that Professor McClay has published include The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, which earned the 1995 Merle Curti Award from the Organization of American Historians, and Land of Hope. Do you have your copy of Land of Hope with you? Oh, Bill's got his. And this has become kind of a classic for schools and homeschools. I think probably some class schools too. And so far as they use textbooks, it's really getting around. And if you're looking for a good overview of American history, that would certainly be one to get. And you can find him online and in various outlets. He's served on the advisory board of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's also a member of the U.S. Commission on the Quincentennial, which is planning the nation's celebration of independence next year. He's also a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and a board member at the Jack Miller Center. And we had Jack and Goldie here in 2009. He's been the recipient of a number of fellowships, including the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the James Madison Program at Princeton University, and the National Academy of Education. Has served as a Fulbright scholar, Fulbright senior lecturer in American history. Bill has a keen mind and, like all good scholars, pays close attention to his sources. I recall meeting the Philadelphia Society where I was asked to say grace over lunch, and he came up to me afterward and provided a terse analysis of my prayer, which I still chuckle about. You've probably forgotten that. His appearance is made possible tonight by the assistance of the Institute for Humane Studies, which is a great organization. They've sponsored a lot of our programs over the years, and since 1961, they've supported students and scholars advancing freedom, political, economic, cultural, and intellectual. Now, Professor McClay is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some questions. I have some questions that have already been prepared, and you get to ask questions too. So I will have that microphone. We have two ladies who will be collecting your written questions. So you give those to them, and they'll bring them to me, and I'll do my best to get through them as best we're able in the time allotted. So look forward to that. And with that, please welcome Professor Bill McClay.
Thank you. And it's really great to be here. I've never been to Midland before. I actually just moved to Michigan, as he said, in 2021. So I'm still getting acquainted with the place. I didn't bring a copy, but I was given this copy to show you what Land of Hope looks like. And I'm actually going to mainly talk about it and what led me to write it. But I did want to mention, it was mentioned in my introduction, I serve on this commission for the semi-quincentennial, which is Latin for 250. And we've kind of realized nobody can pronounce it. You know, it's like he did a good job. Wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. So we've changed it to America 250, which everybody can say that. So America 250, if you see that, that's the same thing. And it's been a very frustrating experience, just because this is bipartisan. I was appointed by Paul Ryan when he was Speaker of the House, and there are all the leading Democrats and Republicans get to appoint. I think it's 4 people, and then there are people who are on the commission who are senators. Who generally don't show up, but send their aides. So it's a mixed bag, and especially I've been on it since 2018, and we didn't get a lot done in the first few years because we were just fighting all the time. And in the middle of all this, I published this book, and I think I did solve one problem. We were having a debate over whether 2026, which is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, should be a celebration or just a occurrence or a memorialization. And we actually had a debate for 2 hours on the commission about whether or not we can call it a celebration. And when I brought copies of this book for everybody on the board, on the commission, and they said, "Oh, thank you so much. We would like you to say a few words about it." And I just got up and said, "You read this book and then tell me whether we should call this anything other than a celebration." So I think I won the day on that. The book accomplished that much. But why did I write it? Any of you who know anything about academia know that for professors to write textbooks is it's pretty close to social death, professional death. It's considered to be beneath. You should write these scholarly monographs that are read by 3 or 4 people, and otherwise unintelligible to the rest of the world. But to write a textbook that everybody can read, you would think would be an exalted thing. Well, no, that's not the way it works. But I was disturbed by the general lack of historical knowledge in our country. I was seeing it in my students. I was seeing it in acquaintances, people my own age, and I've been complaining for years and years, my whole career about the crummy quality. I use some more exalted terms than that, but the crummy quality of textbooks, the general state of historical knowledge, and finally, my conscience sort of landed on the other shoulder and said, why don't you do something about this? And I kind of, well, yeah. And then what happened is that, and I won't go into detail about this, but you all know or have heard of the College Board, which is the organization that administers advanced placement tests to high school students, so they get placed out and get college credit for courses like American history. And they had transformed the course in American history leading up to taking the exam so much that a number of us historians were appalled by it. And we wrote a letter. I actually wrote the letter, and about 200 people signed it, begging them to bring back the old standards. And what I'm talking about, they took out the founding fathers. They took out the Constitution, the debates over the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, all of these things that have generally been central to education in history, civic education, educating American citizens. And instead they had a lot of economic history, which is not bad, but it was mainly economic history of the slave trade and arguing for the primacy of the slave trade in their national economy, which is not only bad history, but it pushes out good history. So we did get them to change their standards back, but the trouble is that all the textbook manufacturers had changed their standards in accordance with what they anticipated that the College Board was going to do in the future. So people started coming around to me saying, well, we really need a new textbook, an alternative textbook. And I said, yeah, you're right. I hope you find somebody to do it. I did not want to be that person, but it finally it caught up with me. The idea that at some point you have to stop moaning and groaning and start doing something, light a candle rather than curse the darkness, as they say. So that's why I did it. In the end, I got talked into it by my publisher. He called me on a Sunday afternoon, which is sort of unusual in the business world. I had just come from church, and I was feeling all cleansed and redeemed and pure as the driven snow, and all wanting to help humanity, give my all. And so he said, "You got to do this for the country," and he got me at a tender moment. So I said yes. I hung up the phone, and my wife said, "What the hell have you done?" So that took up the next year and a half of my life, the writing of this book. So what are the problems that I noticed as I went? One is that American historical writing, you have all these professional historians trained at places like Johns Hopkins, where I had my PhD training, who have very sophisticated techniques, and we know a lot more about a lot more aspects of American history than we did even 30 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. But it's fractured the story. It's fractured the story into 1,000 different pieces, kind of the way our politics has fractured into interest groups, identity politics, instead of having a strong central core awareness of what the American story is and how we share in it. So I kind of, that was one of my first objectives, is to try to overcome that. Also, what I discovered when I started looking at textbooks, I'd been out of high school for a long time. I didn't realize just how bad the textbooks were. They're turgid. They're unreadable. Yes, they are ideologically tilted to the left. That's undeniable. But that's not even the worst thing about them. The worst thing is they're unreadable. And I mean, I can read all kinds of turgid, unreadable stuff, but I found that I was defeated by the textbooks as I was working on. Let's say I was giving an example earlier today. I was working on and something about Andrew Jackson. I'd say, oh, I want to see what this textbook did, and I look at it and think, how is the student supposed to get anything out of this? It's so my sympathies are profoundly with students who have these unreadable textbooks that often are very ideologically slanted, invariably to the left. And they don't have any literary flair. They don't have coherence. They're not fun to read. There's no reason why reading history can't be fun. So I wanted to have something that was readable, that was compulsively readable. People would want to read it. So I discovered, criticism of the status quo is easy, but moving beyond it can be hard. And so it took me an entire summer to write the first chapter of the book, because I knew sort of what I wanted to do, but it took a long time for me to actually do it, actually produce it. And then once I kind of got the hang of that, it was fairly easy going. And it only took me about a year to write once I got that part down. I'd already done something like this before, about 23 years before. For ISI Books, I wrote something called The Student's Guide to U.S. History that is part of this series of guidebooks designed for students to get a liberal education, even though they were at a woke university that didn't teach liberal education, liberal arts. So I did that. I actually wrote it over the Thanksgiving holiday. I wrote it very quickly, but it based on my teaching. It was what I've taught all the time. So all I had to do was write that down. And the one thing about it, it was, I believe it's the best-selling book in that series. And they had very distinguished scholars, much more distinguished than me, writing some of the other guides for political theory, European history, liberal education, and other math, law, other subjects. Mine, I think, was the best selling in the series. And I had people write to me about it. And they would say, this is really great. I love it. It's very tantalizing and fun. Can you recommend a textbook? And I said, well, no, actually, because there was not a textbook recommended in the book. I didn't know of a textbook that I could recommend. And that too started to gnaw at me, the thought that, well, should I be content with that situation? See, that's not my problem. So I did this book, and it's a book that swims against the tide in all sorts of ways, and I want to talk about those. So first thing, my publisher, Encounter Books, which is not a textbook publisher. This is the first effort they'd ever made in that direction. They really went all out, and it's a beautiful book, I have to say. It's almost a coffee table book in the sense of it's being physically beautiful. It's a pleasure to hold it. That I can't take no credit for that, but it's a pleasure to read it. I hope I can take some of the credit for that. And I hope that people will hang on to it and keep it as part of their personal libraries. I know people your age, the personal library was a big deal. People my age, not so much so now, but if you have even a few books, I want my book to be among them. I want you to want to keep it. But, and why a book expresses permanence, stability, stability of meaning. It's not something that changes overnight, whereas a digital source can and does. Pearson, which is the biggest of the textbook publisher, is really in the process of going all digital. You have to specially request physical books, which they call it digital first. So they have a vast array of textbooks in all sorts of subjects, 1,500 titles, including history. And generally, the schools are discouraged from using the actual physical books. And they are a pain to haul around in your knapsack and all of that. But students use tablets, iPads, something similar. And they don't develop a personal library. They don't have a collection of sort of permanent reference sources. This is not surprising. Pearson has been honest about what they're trying to do. They want to drive the secondary book market out of business, meaning eBay and various other resale and rental markets for physical books. They claim digital products produce a greater degree of interactivity with students. And this would represent progress pedagogically. Maybe so. But it's clear what it means as a business proposition. And in the long run, the institutions that adopt Pearson textbooks will be restricting their students' access to the contents that appear on the Pearson platform. The words that appear there will be written on digital sand and constantly subject to revision, and more revision. Kind of like you've probably read, so many of you probably read George Orwell's 1984, The Ministry of Truth, which has the ability to erase and replace the past with the touch of a button. Back in the early days of printing, so I'm making a case for printing, for printed books, for actually physical books. Back in the early days of printing, there was a Latin proverb that printers would mound in their shops, litera scripta manet. And that means the written letter remains, or the written word remains. And that's a saying that's full of meaning, pregnant with meaning. The whole proverb is even more full of the meaning that's sought. Vox audita perit, litera scripta manet, and which means the heard voice perishes, but the written letter remains. The contrast put forward is one between fleeting oral communication, and in some ways, digital culture is more like oral culture than literal culture, literary culture. The contrast between fleeting orality and permanent settled literacy. But what does this proverb mean in our times, when civilizations such as ours, that's up to this point been defined by the permanence of books, where the majority of inhabitants have been as Christians, Jews, people of the book. They seem to be on the road to becoming the people of the screen. We may already have arrived there. The people who are tied to the ever-changing, ever-fluid, ever-malleable presentation of the past made possible by the nature of digital technology. So this is part of the environment into which Land of Hope comes, and offers itself as an alternative, even a sign of contradiction. We wanted to produce a text that not only offered a more capacious and balanced view of American history, but did it in a way that conveys a sense of permanence. So that's one way we went against the current. We are doing a second edition that's going to have some digital backup, and I'll maybe talk about that a little bit. But we went against the current in refusing to dumb the thing down, dumb down the reading level. The book's written with directness and coherence. I think it's fun to read, pleasant to read, pleasurable to read. And but the underlying conviction is that we should aim high, not low, and never sell short the capacity of students, of young people, to read challenging books, if they're interesting and well wrought. These books are more likely, in our view, to fire their imaginations and not insult their intelligence, convey the excitement of history, the fact that history is not just an inert recitation of facts, as Henry Ford said, one damn thing after another, one of my favorite quotations from Henry Ford. But it's a reflective text It takes us to the depths of who we are, of what it means to be human and what it means to be an American. So the books doesn't come at the expense of complexity. I think some of the questions you're likely to ask me are going to touch on this, the complexities of American history. So I do deal with those. But there are certain distinctive emphases or themes that run through the book, like the themes of a rondo or a sonata composition in music. And these themes are all hinted at in the title of the book. First, A Land of Hope. America is a land of hope. This is an important element in my outlook on American history, my argument. America is not just an idea. It's also a people and a nation with a history, with a past, a very particular past, connected as we are to it, to this particular patch of land, this particular piece of real estate. And if we're to understand that nation, it's not enough to understand certain abstract principles that are important, such as equality, liberty, property, representation, and the like. As important as these are, it's not enough to just understand these principles. We have to see how they've been put into action, how they have been developed, how they came to be forces and have a permanent role in our national life. So although American history is inseparable from certain important ideas and ideals, America itself is not simply an idea. It's a place, land of hope. It's a place with a venerable history created by men and women to whom our gratitude and even veneration is owed. I think particularly of those who live not far from where I grew up, Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, people who gave their lives for the country, or those interred at Gettysburg, or the many graveyards scattered around the small towns of this area of the world, whose sacrifice is marked there, or countless others in the whole long history of such sacrifices made on behalf of the country. These things bind us to the land in visceral ways to go beyond questions of ideas or principles. Second, the title is Land of Hope. I call America a land of hope. And in fact, when I started writing the book, that was the first thing I came up with, was the title, Land of Hope. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. I stuck it to my computer screen. And it was there to remind me, because when you're writing a book, you have many occasions where what am I doing? You lose track of your objectives. You get so in the weeds. So I could look at Land of Hope and remember, okay, yes, that's what it's about. Now, that's a title that could be misinterpreted as a sign that I'm going to take a saccharine, sentimental view of the past, but that's not what I had in mind. And that's clear, I think, once people read the book. Part of what I meant to emphasize is that hope is a central element that plays a role throughout the book, and it emphasizes history's spiritual dimension. We are creatures of will and aspiration, not mere tumbleweeds at the mercy of large historical forces. So hope is a quality of the soul. It's something that's not quantifiable or explicable in strictly material terms, but it's a consistent characteristic of our country, of this country, that we've always sought to rise above or transcend the conditions into which we're born. That's precisely what's drawn so many people across the oceans to these shores and continues to do so today. America means a possibility of a second chance in life. To be an American is to believe that our initially given status in life is never the final word about us. You contrast that to some of the countries, the old worlds that various immigrants have come from, where staying in the station into which you were born is exactly what's expected of you. not in America. So we have that spirit of striving, the spirit of hope that I argue goes back to the very beginnings, not just of the United States, but of the Western Hemisphere itself, because all of the peoples of the Western Hemisphere, we believe, came from elsewhere, including those that use the adjective native to describe themselves, but we believe those peoples came from Asia, came across the Bering Straits, in Beringia, and that way into the Western Hemisphere. So this points to a third element, the element of story. The subtitle of the book is An Invitation to the Great American Story. This is an emphasis that runs through the book. Story, narrative, as opposed to analytical propositions piled up on top of one another. And this is something that I insisted on from the start, that it should be about American story and stories, large and small, that these are an essential part of the way we Americans make sense of the world. And I'm going to take liberty here quoting from the text, because I've already said it better than I can say it now, so I'll say it better by reading from the text. But this is from the opening chapter. The impulse to write history and organize our world around stories is intrinsic to us as human beings. We are at our core remembering and story-making creatures. Stories are one of the chief ways we find meaning in the flow of events. I'll just pause here, for this is not in the text, but just think of family life, of how much of your knowledge of your own family comes from the stories that you hear about your parents, about their parents, about other members of the family. It's a braided, extended chain of stories that make up a family's self-consciousness. What we call history and literature is a refinement and intensification of this basic human impulse to tell stories, to string together the factoids of life into a coherent narrative account. And I use the word need. That's not an exaggeration. We need these things. We need stories. For the human being, meaning is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Without meaning, we perish. Historical consciousness is to civilization, civilized society, what memory is to the individual identity. Without memory, without the stories by which our memories are carried forward, that's how we remember things, by their being embedded in stories. Without that, we can't say who we are, what we are. Without stories, our life and thought dissolve into a meaningless, unrelated rush of events. Without them, we cannot do the most human of things. We cannot learn. We cannot use language, pass on knowledge, raise children, establish rules of conduct, engage in science, or dwell harmoniously in society. And do business, I might add, for this location. Without them, we cannot govern ourselves. Nor can we have a sense of the future as a time we know will come, because we remember that other tomorrows have come and gone. A culture without memory will be barbarous and easily tyrannized, even if it's technologically advanced. The incessant waves of daily events will occupy all our attention and defeat our efforts to connect past, present, and future, thereby diverting us from an understanding of the human things that unfold in time, the path of our own lives. I'm still quoting from the book here. The stakes were beautifully expressed in the words of a great Jewish writer named Isaac Bashevis Singer. And he said this: when a day passes, it's no longer there. What remains of it? Nothing more than a story. If stories weren't told and books weren't written, man would live like the beasts only for the day. The whole world, all human life, is one long story. Singer was right. As individuals, as communities, as countries, we're nothing more than flotsam and jetsam floating on the stream without the stories in which we find our lives' meanings. There are stories of which we're already a part. The American story, certainly everyone in this room is already a part of the American story, whether we know it or not. The basis of our common life, the webs of meaning in which our shared identities are suspended, that's the basis of our community life, these webs of meaning. Now, that's the end of my quoting my book, but and let me add to this. There are stories and there are stories, okay? Andre Malraux, who was a great French writer and resistance fighter in the Second World War, said this, pretty cynical. He said, "A man is what he hides, a miserable little pile of secrets." Well, that's one way of thinking about a biography. We've all read biographies like that. It turns out that he was a plaster of Paris saint who was hiding a secret of his crimes. We've all read biographies like that. We read them in the daily papers. We love biographies like that. It's a sort of guilty pleasure. But where in this approach is the account of a man's striving, his deepest ambitions, his deepest loves, his motivating ideals, his efforts at transcendence? Is it really a fair account of a man to speak only of his silences and his failings, his concealments, his deceptions? One can ask similar questions about a nation's history. I think a lot of our historians are transfixed by this idea that a nation is what it hides, a miserable little pile of secrets. But it must be more than that. It must be more than a compilation of secrets and crimes, things hidden, things missing. It must give credence to the aspirational aspect of our nature, and particularly for so aspirational a nation as the United States, which I argue is the most aspirational nation in all of human history. And that is not, and I don't in the book do this, to blink the failures, the ways that we've fallen short, even miserably short, shamefully short at times of our objectives and done terrible things. We have not been the land of hope for everybody, for a great many, but not for all. And so our very sense of hope has, as I repeatedly say in the book, a double-edged quality about it. Because to be a land of hope can also mean risking, it does mean risking being a land of disappointment, a land of frustration, a land even of disillusionment. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, nothing ventured, nothing lost. You have to risk the thing you hope for in order to achieve it. And the risk is all in the fact that you might fail. So we experience these negative things, and we experience them maybe sharply because we think of ourselves as a land of hope, and we embrace that outlook, that doctrine, that aspiration. We Americans, in a sense, allow ourselves to get our hopes up, and that's always risky. But it's a lot better than the alternative of a life, of a society without aspiration, without hope in that gut level, visceral sense of the term. And then finally, the subtitle, it's an invitation to the great American story. It's an invitation. It's not the whole party. It's meant to usher readers into a larger room, to acquaint them with this story, to tantalize them with the story, make them want to know more and to go further, and to make them recognize that this is a gathering of which they're already a part, even if they did not know it or feel it before. It's a sort of voyage of self-discovery, can be. I hope that I've done that with this book. So the story is not just someone else's, it's theirs too, the reader's too. It's yours too, if you wish to claim it. Part of the invitation is I don't claim this is a definitive American history. And there'll never be such a thing. There's always going to be debates. There's always going to be ways in which we see the past differently because of events that we can't foresee now may cause us to look back and see things that we didn't think were significant turn out to be vastly significant, and things that we thought were significant at the time turn out to just be blips. So there'll never be a definitive American history. And I haven't sought to be comprehensive either, to tell you everything about everything. If you want to get a deep explanation of one of the important but not super important Supreme Court decisions, you won't get it from my book. I might name it and give you the date so that you can look it up, but I've tried to have a smooth narrative that's not interrupted as much as possible. So it would be a foolish thing for me to have done it any other way. The book is an invitation. It's meant to catch people's interest, draw them into something larger than themselves. I hope that readers will fly past what I've done and discover in American history a subject that's vast and inexhaustible for the rest of their lives, whatever they end up doing with their lives. And I also would add that this may well be the only book of the students who read this book, maybe the only book of American history they ever read. So I want to make that count. I want them to have a takeaway that's going to impact their lives for good. I don't know how we're doing on time, but oh yeah, we're doing fine. To get a good sense of the book, there's no substitute for reading from it. And I want to read you several passages to conclude my remarks. But before I do, I want to read you something else from the book. It was the first two things I wrote were the title and the epigraph. And that's a term may not be familiar to you. That's, when you open a book, there's some kind of fancy quotation at the beginning, usually from Shakespeare or somebody like that, and then the book begins. That's the epigraph. It's meant to sort of tantalize the reader with an idea. This is what the book is going to be about. So I did. Usually it's just a one-line quotation. Well, I have a whole page-long quotation, the epigraph page. But I did it because this quote summarized so well what my intention was with the book. What I think history, particularly history for high school students, college students, ought to be about. And they're the words of a man, again, name you won't know probably, John Dos Passos. John Dos Passos was about 100 years ago, a great American novelist, a great experimental novelist. And a person who was very critical of America. He was on the far left of his times, a radical activist. He changed over time, and by the 1940s, he was a conservative and really liked America. Thought America was worth fighting for, in fact. But and he wrote an essay called "The Use of the Past" in 1941, and I want to read from that. This is the epigraph of my book. Again, this is John Dos Passos' words, not mine. I wish I could claim it, but every generation rewrites the past. In easy times, history is more or less of an ornamental art. But in times of danger, we're driven to the written record by a pressing need to find answers to the riddles of today. We need to know what kind of firm ground other men belonging to generations before us have found to stand on. In spite of changing conditions of life, they were not very different from ourselves. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. They managed to meet situations as difficult as those we have to face, to meet them sometimes lightheartedly, and in some measure to make their hopes prevail. We need to know how they did it. That's only the first half of the quotation, but that's all pretty good to roll around in your mind. And then even better part, the second half. In times of change and danger, when there's a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present and get us past that idiot delusion of the exceptional now that blocks good thinking. That's why in times like ours, when old institutions are caving in and being replaced by new institutions, not necessarily in accord with most men's preconceived hopes, political thought has to look backwards as well as forwards. I think that's just a marvelous quotation, and there's a lot to unpack in it. But I want to point out one thing about its context for you to think about. He uses that phrase, the idiot delusion of the exceptional now. And certainly isn't that something we suffer from? We were living in an unprecedented time. Nothing like this has ever existed. We have these things in our pockets. These things in our pockets that make render everything irrelevant. Well, that's a delusion. That's a delusion. It does change things. And every technological advance changes things. And some that are very threatening to many people, like AI, just for example. And we can argue about whether or not AI is something people should be scared about, but they are. Many people are scared of it. That's different. But the questions of what our basic humanity is about and how we face difficulties have not really changed. What I wanted to point out to you is 1941. It's when he wrote this essay. Some of you may recognize the year 1941 as the year that America entered the Second World War because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. But this was written in January of 1941, and we were not in the war then. We were not. Britain really was standing out all by itself against the Nazis who had conquered the entire European continent or controlled the European continent. And we're just looking for a way to take Britain down. This is a time when he writes about the use of the past, how a sense of a lifeline that reaches back to the past and gives you a sense of connectivity with what came before. This was a moment when he could be forgiven for saying, we've never had anything like Hitler before. We've never had such a powerful military force before in the world. This is unprecedented. And even comparison to Alexander the Great or Napoleon, it sort of doesn't even come close. But he didn't say that. He says what I read to you, that in times of, actually I should go back to it. In times of change and danger, when there's a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, that certainly describes now, doesn't it? And it describes 1941. A sense of continuity the generations with gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present. So that's one of the ways history can and should be used. I love that phrase, the idiot delusion of the exceptional now. It's all of us who teach history run up against this. And it's hard, always been hard to get young people interested in the past. I was not interested in the past as a young person. But it's even harder today because we're so firmly convinced that we are living in an unprecedented time. And all bets are off, all comparisons to the past are inadequate. It's a new paradigm entirely. And these technologies that we carry around in our pockets are so transformative that there's really no point in looking back at what happened in the 17th century or the 19th century, because it's all been superseded, just as our present world is forever in the condition of being superseded. Creative destruction, which is a principle of capitalism. This posture of the idiot delusion, what he calls the idiot delusion, is it can be lazy. It's a way of justifying not learning anything at all. But it's, for many of us, it's a genuine conviction that is amply reinforced by the passing parade of sensations and images in which we're all enveloped. One thing always being succeeded by something else, nothing being permanent, nothing enduring, always moving into this exceptional now. But according to Dos Passos, and according to my book, at least the premise of my book, that's not true. So how do I handle, I think one of the things people always want to ask me is how I handle some of the most difficult, challenging questions of the American past, like the existence of slavery and it's the degree to which the scars of slavery have persisted into the present. So here's an example of one, I can't quote all the places where I deal with that issue, but this is one that comes at the end of the chapter that deals with the Constitutional Convention in 1787, that gives you a sense of the kind of reasoning I engage in. I start out pointing out that at the time of the Constitutional Convention, the institution of slavery, race-based slavery, had become deeply enmeshed in the national economy, despite all the ways that its existence stood in glaring contradiction to the national commitment to equality and self-rule as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. We were mocked by people like the British sage and wit Samuel Johnson, who said this: "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps from liberty from among the drivers of Negroes?" I'm quoting him there. But it's an excellent question. How can you talk about liberty when you're enslaving people? And it's particularly relevant when we take into account so many of the founders, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, even, who I think is still our greatest president, were themselves owners of slaves. How, we wonder today, and students always want to know, want to try to understand this, how can it be that otherwise enlightened people, exemplary people, men and women, are blind to the fundamental contradiction, the humanity of those that they can find? So here's what I say. How could they have made their peace with practices so utterly contradictory to all they stood for? There's no easy answer to this question. But surely a part of the answer is that each of us is born into a world that we did not make. And it's only with the greatest of effort and often at great cost that we are ever able to change the world for the better. Moral sensibilities are not static. They develop and deepen over time. And general moral progress is very slow, but it does occur. Part of the training of history is the training of the imagination, learning to see the actors of the past as speaking and acting in their own times rather than ours, and learning to see even our heroes as an all-too-human mixture of admirable and unadmirable traits. People like us who may, like us, be constrained by circumstances beyond their control. So I go on here that they explain how the Constitution is ambivalent about slavery. It doesn't protect it as an institution, although in some respects it allows for its existence. The ambivalences regarding slavery built into the structure of the Constitution were almost certainly unavoidable in the short term in order to achieve an effective political union of the nation. What we need to understand today is how the original compromise no longer became acceptable to increasing numbers of America, especially in one part of the Union, the North. Slavery has been a ubiquitous institution in human history, in every place and every time. But it came somehow in the 18th century. A moral development occurred that began to see slavery not just as an unfortunate thing, maybe even an unfortunate evil, but a sinful impediment to human progress, a stain on an entire nation. So we live today, and this is, again, ending this in my book, we live today on the other side of a great transformation in moral sensibility, a transformation that was taking place, but not yet complete in the very years the United States was being formed. Okay, that's one example. A couple of others. One thing I want my readers to understand is genuine acts of statesmanship require tremendous courage and imagination, even daring, especially when the outcome seems doubtful. I'm bringing the example of Lincoln. We're so accustomed to thinking of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, as a demigod, and we forget, or we never knew, some important things about him. He was deeply unpopular during his time in office. Deeply unpopular. Few great leaders in human history have been more comprehensively disdained or loathed or misunderstood, underestimated. Of course, the Southerners had a low view of him. That's to be expected. But that low view was widely shared above the Mason-Dixon line. Lincoln's biographer, David Donald, put it this way. Lincoln's own associates thought him a simple Susan. That's a sort of period term, simple Susan. A baboon, an aimless punster, a smutty joker. The abolitionist Wendell Phillips called him a huckster in politics, a first-rate, second-rate man. Well, that's a good one. First-rate, second-rate man. George McClellan, General George McClellan, who was his opponent in the 1864 election. We had an election in the middle of a civil war. Isn't that amazing? And Lincoln was very afraid of losing, and with good reason. McClellan called him a well-meaning baboon, as opposed to malicious baboons. But okay. And so here's my comment on this. We need to remember this is how history happens. It's not like a Hollywood movie in which the background music swells and the crowd in the room applauds and leaps to its feet as the orator dispenses timeless words and the camera pans to a room full of smiling faces. In real history, the background music is not there, and let alone swelling. The trumpets don't sound. The carping critics often seem louder than the applause, if there is any. The leader or the soldier has to wonder if he's doing the right thing. Is he acting in vain? Whether the criticisms of others that are ringing in his ears are in fact true. Whether time will judge him harshly. Whether his sacrifice will count for anything. Few great leaders have felt this burden more completely than Lincoln. And you all probably know Lincoln was actually subject to fits of depression and this sense of burden, of uncertainty, of can I believe in what I'm doing when so many people are telling me it's the wrong thing. And finally, here's a story about the end of the Civil War, which I think has some relevance to today and our attitude toward the past. So on April 9th, 1865, after the last flurry of Southern resistance, General Lee, Robert E. Lee, faced facts and arranged to meet General Grant at a brick home in the village of Appomattox Courthouse to surrender his army. He couldn't surrender for the whole Confederacy, but the surrender of his army would trigger the surrender of all the others. And so it represented the end of the Confederate cause. It was a poignant scene, dignified and restrained and sad, as when a terrible storm that's raged and blown has finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a strange and reverent calm, purged of all passion. The two men had known one another in the Mexican War, which is about 20 years before, a little less than that. But they'd not seen one another in nearly 20 years. Lee arrived first, wearing his elegant dress uniform, soon to be joined by Grant, who was wearing his mud-spattered sack coat, his trousers tucked into his muddy boots. Probably had some cigar ashes on the front of it, too. Characteristically, he was kind of a slob. And Lee was never a slob. So they showed one another deep and respectful courtesy, as competing generals, 4 stars, tend to do. And Grant generously allowed Lee's officers to keep their sidearms and the men to keep their horses and take them home for the spring planting, because most of them were farmers. None would be arrested or charged with treason. 4 days later, when Lee's army of 28,000 men marched to surrender, General Joshua Chamberlain of Maine was present at the ceremony, and he wrote his observations, reflecting on his respect for these men before him, each passing by and stacking his arms. Men that days before had been mortal foes. And here I quote, in my quote, I quote Joshua Chamberlain. Before us in proud humiliation stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster or hopelessness could bend from their resolve, standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, and with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into a union so tested and assured? On our part, that is his army, the Union Army, on our part, not a sound of trumpet more, or roll of drum, or cheer, nor word or whisper of vainglory, nor motion of, motion of man standing again at the order, but an awed stillness still, and breath holding as if it were the passing of the dead. Such deep sympathies in a victory so heavily tinged with sadness and grief and death. This war is and remains to this day America's bloodiest conflict, having generated somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000 dead. Interestingly, they keep revising the number up. I don't know quite what the information is after all this time that causes them to do that. But I think the story that I've just told related at the end of this bitterest and bloodiest of American wars, and the sentiment for reconciliation tells us something about our conflicts today, that maybe something like this kind of recognition of our commonalities can rescue us from a sort of lifetime of separation and spite, and be part of that lifeline stretching back to the past. So I think I better stop there. I've used up a lot of time and have a lot to say. So thank you all for your attention.
Okay, so ladies are going to collect any written questions that you all have. Just raise your hand and they'll head over and pick that up. And I've got a question. It was not a student question, but I've got a question.
Okay.
So why is America the most aspirational? So I'll give you an alternative. The Romans, now they were aspirational, or the British or the Persians, they were aspirational. We've just.
Well, I think this would be a long discussion that might get very boring, but why don't I say the most aspirational nation in the modern world? Would you be comfortable with that?
Sure, but what makes it aspirational? In other words, what are we aspiring to?
It is the sense that we exist as a land of second chances. And immigration is an important part of that. So we are a land of, I mean, it affects all of us, this sense that we are not people who accept the notion that the conditions of our birth dictate what we will become in life. You know, we have this term, make something of yourself. It's a lot of times common language carries a heavy weight of meaning that we don't even think about. But to make something of yourself, boy, are you ever going to get off your rear end and make something of yourself? That's or you say it to yourself. That's an implication that what you are is yet to be done. It's something you aspire to, but yet to achieve.
Is it fair to say the aspirational character of America is that it's a place for people to aspire?
Well, and it's a land of opportunity, which I think is still the case, which has something to do with our economic institutions, battered though they be, and overregulated though they be, that they're still freer and have been freer over the course of our history, free and full of points of entry. Because again, I think of immigration has become such a negative term because of the waves of illegal immigrants, and I'm not going to really deal with that, but I'm thinking of legal immigration and the immigration that took place roughly between 1870 and 1920, 25. That's when you get the great waves of European, Central and Eastern European immigrants and some Asians as well. That's really a period of time in which I think immigration has the effect, and I see this in immigrants that I meet today, that it renews the sense of the nation's promise. They have that effect. So the fact that we're so heavily an immigrant country and have been for much of our history, more sometimes than others. We had very little immigration between the 1920s and the 1960s. And that was probably a good thing for the nation to kind of consolidate itself. And we may need another period like that moving ahead from where we are now.
I have a student question related to that. So, and you had talked about America being not an idea, of course, but
not only an idea.
Not only an idea.
Not only,
yeah,
but it is an idea, but not only an idea.
Right. So there is a people and there is a place. So this is very controversial right now, right? That do you see there being a necessary opposition between the idea of the country being an idea and being a people and a place?
I don't think there has to be an opposition. I think part of what our peoplehood, our national memory is that idea. You see it, and it's really fascinating. James McPherson, the Civil War historian, has studied a lot of the letters that soldiers on both sides of the war wrote, and it's amazing how much they appeal to certain kinds of abstract notions of what America is. They're different. The Southern soldiers would emphasize self-governance, self-rule, self-sovereignty, state sovereignty, and Union soldiers other things more in line with the way we think about individualism now. But there's a great deal of idealism and idealism in the sense of commitment to an idea, an ideal, and not just to. The reason he wrote these books is to try to refute the idea that, why did men fight in the Civil War? And the usual answer is, well, they fought to defend. The Southerners fought to defend their land. That's why, that's the main reason they fought in this conventional view. And he manages to refute that in fact they were, if their letters are any evidence, and if you're writing home to your spouse, your sister, or whatever, it's not likely you're going to be writing something with a sort of political correctness filter on it. You're going to be telling the person, the recipient, what you feel. So there's a mixture of kind of attachment to the land, to the history, to the literature and arts and conveyances, places and the graves of those who've given their lives in the past, that mingles with the idea. You see this, Lincoln's very good at this mingling. He, in the first inaugural address, I can't quote it from memory, but he concludes with this invocation of the mystic chords of memory that unite every battlefield with every hearth. It's it's connecting the patriotic idea with the sort of ideal of domestic life, of our home, our place, our roots. He was able to appeal to both things at once. So what I'm objecting to is this sort of notion that America is nothing but an idea. And I think that's increasingly, well, I think it's actually on the way out now, but it was for a while very much the view of people in our foreign policy community, and that we had the American idea was something you could plant anywhere, and didn't matter what kind of soil, it would sprout up, and you could have Jeffersonian democracy in Iraq in the flash of your eye, and had not worked out that way.
I have a question from the audience, which I think is related to that. So someone asks, I think of our predecessors as uniquely suited for liberty and aspiration. But think by contrast, we have become pessimistic and complacent. Are we still a land of hope? This is not a historian question, I guess.
Yeah, no, but that's a good question. And it's one that you have to grapple with. I think there are layers and layers in people, and that you often, what I've found in my too many years on this earth is that people will respond in ways you cannot possibly predict when they are presented with a challenge that they can't evade. And that challenge, war for the generation that went to war in the 1940s was that kind of thing. We call them the greatest generation, but I don't know that they were so great before they went. They had a challenge. They reached into the sort of deepest recesses of their psyche and pulled out something great. So I think we can, there's every reason to think we're fat, happy, complacent, pessimistic too, along with it. We're fat, happy, complacent, and pessimistic. That's an odd combination of things. Maybe what we need is the energy, the electricity of a challenge that will we'll stop being fat. We might be happy, but we're happy because we engaged in doing something meaningful and worthwhile. I love, but I'm just driving here. For some reason, I happen to go by several Marine Corps recruiting posters, and the Marines seem to be the last redoubt of appeal to that notion that join us and you're going to be lucky if you make it. It's a great challenge. It's a great, great pride. And you often see them use the imagery of chivalry, that to be a Marine is to be like a knight, a medieval knight, to be initiated into this sort of band of brothers. They're appealing to something that is out there. It obviously works as a recruiting device because there are young men, maybe some in this audience, who feel that call within themselves beyond the mundane, and beyond being fat, happy, and complacent and pessimistic, but want instead the excitement, the challenge, the sort of bringing your life to a point that happens when you take on something big. So our lives are too unchallenging. That's a part of the problem. It's not as if we don't have challenges, though.
We may not want the event that
no,
ends
of
our
course
complacency.
we don't. That's the way it always is, isn't it? that the thing that jolts us out of complacency and makes us aware of the breadth of what we could be doing and now have to be doing with our lives doesn't come. We don't decide on it. Events conspire to present us with that. We're certainly going to have some kind of major economic event in the coming years, and I mean that's sort of like an astrological forecast. Pleasant prospects for the future are indicated, but no, we surely are. $38 trillion of debt, and this is all of you should be so angry about this. I mean, young people should be so angry about being saddled with this by my generation and the Generation X. They don't get off easy either. All the Zs, they would have every reason to be very angry. It's going to be your challenge to figure out how to deal with this binge of borrowing, living beyond our means that has been characteristic of our fat, happy, pessimistic way of life.
Back to existential events. Then we'll close with this. You're planning, or you've been planning, the nation's 250th, and I know we're talking about it here. So leave us with the best thing to think about when we think about the founding, when we think about the beginning of America.
Yeah, well, I may have a disappointing answer. I mean, my answer may be disappointing to you, but I think first and foremost, it should be a celebration. And, there's a guy, well, he's the president of the American Historical Association. So he represents the organization for all the professional historians. And he has delivered himself of the opinion that, I'm afraid that what's going to come out of your commission and the Trump administration, as if we were the same thing, is an unapologetic history of America. As if what we should be doing is apologizing. And I wrote him a letter. He's never written back to me, but he went on to say, the 4th of July, 2026 should be a day of atonement for all the things that America's done wrong. And I wrote him a note and said, Jim, I know him well enough to call him Jim. Is this how you observe the birthdays of your children? By saying, it's time to have a day of atonement for their birthday. No, you wouldn't do that unless you were really cruel then. What about the nation's birthday? Is the main thing we do sort of whip ourselves, flagellate ourselves? No, we have a party. So that's the part that might be. I think the most important thing is for us to have a party, and to have it be a party where we lay down our differences the way that those Southern soldiers laid down their weapons at the end of the Civil War, and have it be like a family reunion. In the South, I've lived in the South a lot of my life, and I'm not a Southerner, but I sort of appreciate the South. They have these enormous family reunions, and it happens elsewhere too. But in the South, they're huge, and they often are bi or multiracial. And people, when they come to the hundreds of people, they come, and they're all members of this, let's say, the Smith family, and there are people who are not on speaking terms with one another. Divorces, every manner of tragedy and thing can have happened, and yet they all come, and the ones who are not on speaking terms stay on opposite sides of the field or the room, but they all come. Why do they all come? Because they're all Smiths. And that's kind of the way I've tried with the commission to see this, that we don't need to adjudicate whether America is guilty or innocent. That's for God to do. What we need to do is celebrate what we have, and to celebrate what we have with one another. So that's the line I've been pushing, and I'll continue to push it. I think we're gonna get there too. I think it's going to be good. If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I'd say, "Oh, this is the biggest waste of time I've ever done in my life to be on this commission." But I think that And we do have a cooperative White House, which has been very helpful. And they're doing good things, the White House staff. So that helps a lot to have a White House that's really interested in celebrating the 250th. So but if you're interested in some way contributing to it, what I would suggest you do, and I can't give you the contact information, but if you want to write to me, I can give it to you. Your local 250th, Michigan has a 250th commission. It's actually pretty active. And a lot of smaller towns are doing things. You could do something in Midland that could be really neat. One of the things that's come, I know I need to stop talking, but you've got me on a subject I want to talk about. One of the good things about the fact that we on the commission couldn't agree is that little historical societies, and you've got them all, places like Michigan have it's just lousy with historical societies, little old blue-haired ladies who keep these wonderful archives. And so local people said, well, gosh, we could do something here in Pottsville or wherever, and they're doing it. So it's been a sort of decentralized thing, and we serve as a clearinghouse for connecting people and encouraging them, giving them guidance about how to set things up. And it's not been the way it was supposed to work, but it has worked in spite of us. So I will stop there. And
Thanks for being with us,
thank you
and
all
don't
very
forget the
much.
reception. Right out here.